समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Lubricated with lashings of cognac, the plan to stop a world war emerged over dinner one summer night in 1940. The world's largest producer of crude oil, the United States, would end all exports to Germany and Japan, British Ambassador Philip Kerr and Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. proposed. The Royal Air Force would then bomb the synthetic oil plants along France's Rhone Valley and blow up wells in the Dutch East Indies. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the then US President, was electrified. The only way out, he agreed, and I quote, was by the starving of the people of Europe, particularly in regard to their supply of fuel to carry on the war. 80 years later, another American president, Donald Trump, has turned to similar economic coercion in an effort to secure his nation's continued global hegemony. The massive tariffs Trump has imposed on China in key senses have nothing to do with tariffs themselves. Trump, as economic journalist Will Dunn points out, is telling other powers that the price of access to America's gargantuan markets is obedience to America's rules. Trump's sanctions then, in essence, contain an unspoken geopolitical message. To continue harvesting the American wealth that has helped it become a great power, China will need to stop challenging American power over its allies in Asia such as Taiwan, South Korea and Japan. Likewise, President Xi Jinping will have to abandon his plans to create a coalition of states to challenge the dominance of the West. Trump sees the pain of economic dislocation as a better way to send that message than the savage suffering of war. Likely, Trump's strategists see this moment in history as an exceptionally good time to twist the dragon's tail and drag it back into its cage. China is struggling with a slump in the critical property sector, growing joblessness crisis, and anemic domestic demand. Only a few of the country's expensive Belt and Road global projects have delivered returns, and many investors have been taking haircuts in countries from Pakistan to Sri Lanka. The last thing China now needs is a trade war. From the story of the oil embargo that the US imposed on Japan in 1940, after that dinner I began my story with, there are valuable lessons to be learned. American sanctions ended supplies of high-octane aviation fuel, scrap iron and lubricants, an effort to cripple the war economy of Japan. There's no doubt it worked. The sanctions compelled Japan to divert badly needed machines, materials and men to increase the production of iron ore. It forced Japan to draw heavily upon the hoarded stockpiles of scrap iron and iron ore. And together these destroyed all hopes for increasing steel production ahead of a full-scale war, historian Irvine Anderson has recorded. There was just no way, it seemed, that Japan could sustain a war in the face of these sanctions. And then this happened. Fearing the power asymmetry between it and the West would only grow as the sanctions bit harder, Japan sought out and targeted America's Pacific Fleet in December 1941 at Pearl Harbor. Japanese military commanders gambled that they could deliver one knockout blow with what they had, putting America's feared Pacific Fleet out of the war once and for all, rather than risk losing everything as the sanctions bit. Following the end of the First World War, Japan emerged with its ambitions sharply reined in. The country acquired some minor islands and the port of Shandong in China, Naoko Shimazu explains. To get this, however, it gave up a far more important demand for all powers to be treated on the basis of racial equality. Later, at negotiations in Washington, The world's great powers agreed that the UK and the US could maintain fleets of 500,000 tons, but Japan only 300,000 tons. The parties were also barred from new bases in the Pacific, which hurt the Japanese the most. The bottom line from this deal was a simple one. For all practical purposes, Japan would have had to agree to remain a second-rate power in a world dominated by the United Kingdom and the United States. Few were surprised by this in or outside the country, historian Eri Hota writes. There is a law of nations, it is true, ran a Japanese ditty popular in the 1880s. But when the moment comes, remember the strong eat up the weak. Back in 1853, American naval commander Matthew Perry sailed into Edo Bay, determined to end 2 centuries-long policy of Japanese isolationism. Within a year, faced with these gunboat attacks, Japan agreed to begin trade, conceding the American demands. There were, however, deep resentments building up in Japan. Liberals and Marxists were willing to make concessions for integration into a wider West-led order, seeing it as a path to modernization. Ethnic nationalists, however, saw Japan as the rightful Meishu, or leader of a new pan-Asian continental order. Following these events, Japan entered the period of the Meiji Restoration, embracing Western technology and communications infrastructure to develop its own industrial power. The Japanese did this process of growth remarkably well. In 1904, Japan was able to stage a surprise attack on the Russian naval fleet, leading to land victories in the Battle of Mukden and the Battle of Tsushima. This was the first time an Asian power had registered military success against a white army. For many across Asia, these victories signaled that subjugation by the West was not inevitable or part of the natural order. And among the people who was impressed was India's to-be Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, who wrote that as a young man he, I quote, mused of Indian freedom and Asiatic freedom from the thraldom of Europe. Leaders of the so-called Kwantung Army responded to this new situation by developing a plot to create their own empire by seizing China's 3 northeastern provinces in 1931, likely without the direct approval of their civilian commanders in Tokyo. The fighting rapidly expanded southwards towards Shanghai. The pan-Asian Japanese imperialists were showing themselves to be pretty much like other imperialists by this time. The institutionalized use of rape and massacre in the Battle of Nanking, which was China's then capital city seized by the Japanese army in 1937, continues to scar China's consciousness, Iris Chang has written. The barbarity of the Japanese campaign in China mirrored what the Nazis would later do in Europe, historian Doug Hickey and his co-authors have recorded. Led by the notorious General Ishii Shiro, thousands were subjected to chemical and biological warfare experiments. The experiments carried out on Chinese children, prisoners of war, and ordinary villagers in China's Manchuria included injecting subjects with bubonic plague and then vivisecting them to study their organs. Fury against the war of colonization in China, coupled with strategic self-interest, brought increasing pressure on the United States to intervene. The country responded with a thoroughgoing program of sanctions intended to inflict costs on Japan's military and civil society. Edward Miller's excellent book on the sanctions regime shows how the template for generations of subsequent actions was first formed. First, dollars and gold held by Tokyo and American banks were frozen, making it hard for Japan to make purchases. Following this, sales of military aircraft were squeezed, falling to almost zero. Though Japan could make its own aircraft, the US stepped up the pressure by ending supplies of critical metals like aluminium, magnesium, and molybdenum. Finally came the end of sales of scrap metal and fuel. This presented Japanese military planners with a simple choice. They could act before their resources were depleted and deliver one quick blow in the hope it would knock the US out of the Pacific. Alternately, they could scale back their own imperial ambitions and reconcile themselves to being a second-rate power. Early on the morning of 7 December 1941, the choice Japan had made became clear. a raid of breathtaking audacity on Pearl Harbor with planes which almost certainly used American-made aviation fuel, hammered America's Pacific Fleet. That very day, though, Japan also lost the war. The three great American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not in port that day, and that gave the United States Navy the ability to fight on. And as it did fight on, America's gun-to-an industrial base geared up, by far matching Japan's sanctions-hit productive capacities. The war still lasted for longer than anticipated, in part because Japan had prepared for the worst. The Yokohama Specie Bank, Miller writes, ran a secret dollar network that managed to pay for imports under the very noses of US regulators. The Japanese had also built up stockpiles of metals and minerals that were key to the war effort. All of this eventually didn't work though. Just like Nazi Germany, Japan was bled dry by its lack of fuel and metals. President Xi Jinping knows this history better than most. And he also knows China isn't the resource-strained, industrially underprepared country Japan was in 1941. He will be considering if following his national dreams of taking over Taiwan and more territory on China's peripheries is worth the damage that will be caused to China. The disturbing truth is nations do not always make rational choices, any more than what all of us do as humans is always rational. Trump's vision of American hegemony or Xi's ideas of a coming moment of Chinese greatness is, like Japan's fantasy of a pan-Asian empire, an ideological construction, a story on which nation-states base their sense of themselves and their destinies. Twisting the dragon's tail, as Trump is doing, yes, maybe could lead it back to its cage. But it's just as possible the response will be a savage growl, a bite, and a blast of fire. I'm Praveen Swami and I'm a contributing editor to ThePrint. Thank you for watching this episode of Security Code.